I'm speaking for Dan Anderson, who's running late. He's the head trustee, and with Jen's tutoring, we're coming up with a new system as to how to balance our budgets a little better. Because we were used to the old grant system.
So these are all 2019 transfers on both sides.
Right.
Do we have any problems with the auditors?
No.
These are all encumbered.
Because when I first read it and I saw the snow removal, I'm like, it's a little early to be moving money out of snow removal.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the transfers that you have in this packet are just
Yeah.
final year-end cleanup of fiscal
Yeah.
19.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have any problem with any of the transfers to make what we have, and I know there were some unforeseen things. I followed the unfortunate news and developments. I didn't know it was that, frankly, I didn't know it was that bad, but it happened, and I think the transfers all add up to get to the number you need, and you cleaned up some of the stuff in those balances, so I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Any other questions? Comments?
No,
So do we have a motion to approve?
so moved.
Second.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, all in favor?
Have a good night.
Good
Thank you
night.
very
Thank you.
much.
Thanks for
Thank you.
coming by. So Jen, how do you want to work these other transfers?
Why don't we just go through them while we're on the
Yeah,
topic?
yeah.
They're all pretty similar, just year-end cleanup type of items. So I don't know if you want to ask specific questions and then make a motion to
Well,
approve all of them. or-
I had one. You know my old bugaboo. I'm sure there's something going on. So how did the one for $1,200 get in here?
Because it's coming from contingency.
Ah, okay, good. Okay. I see. Right.
And I had a question about that. The Public Works one and the credit card charges. Why is Public Works responsible for credit card charges?
Because those are the credit card charges associated with the parking pay stations.
And that's not the parking?
This is the general fund portion of the parking pay stations. Because most of it is covered by the parking fund, but a couple of the lots get allocated partially to general.
And do we need a transfer on the parking side?
No, the parking fund, because it is its own fund, it is all for that purpose. If there is an overage, we don't have to do a transfer. Same with the sewer operating fund.
And in a way, this isn't all bad because there's revenue that's associated.
Correct.
There's more revenue. They only have more charges because there's more revenue.
Right, and if we look at the history, it's gone up, it was $2,665 in 2017, up to $5,000 in 18, $6,700 in 19. So it's good, we're getting more activity through the pay stations, and it's more convenience for either using the app or using credit card at the pay stations, but there is a cost associated with it.
And do you think it's budgeted adequately for the coming year?
I think we're gonna be a little bit short this year. For some reason, this is one that has always slipped through the cracks, and they haven't had a budget until fiscal 20. There's a budget of $5,000. So I think it will be a little bit short this year, but not to the same extent.
Does anybody have any questions about this public health one? So why did you advise them? What was off about the accounting?
So it was a very small grant. I think it was 5,000.
Yeah, roughly 5,000.
And the state changed to a new grants management system that would have involved a lot more online administration, reporting, and when the health director looked at the $5,000 that he could get from the grant versus the amount of time he would be spending learning this new system, fulfilling all of their requirements for reporting, he came to the town administrator and me, and we had a discussion of, you know, what's the benefit of the grant versus the cost to administer it, and we decided that for a $5,000 grant, we should forego it. He was able to cover most of the additional, or most of the unbudgeted cost through surpluses and other accounts, so he just needs the $1,200 to make his department whole.
And going forward, is this grant, what's the,
No, the expectation is that we won't receive this grant in the future.
And what do the ongoing costs look like, doing what we did decide to do?
About $5,000. He has some control over how much, because this is the part-time for the nurse, I believe, and he can manage that within the budget that he requested. The fiscal '20 assumed that he wouldn't apply for the grant, so he's budgeted for that.
So essentially what we have is an increase of expenses of $5,000 that's not covered by a grant. And the rationale for doing that is just that it's, I mean, obviously it's not a cost savings, so there must be a different rationale.
Right, because the reporting and administration requirements from the state were perceived to be excessive for the amount of the grant.
Right, okay.
and the balance of the, this is only 1,200,
Right.
and the balance of the,
He was able to do that through an administrative transfer within his department to move other surpluses around. So he could cover everything but this $1,200 internally.
Well, my own experience with government grants is that he might be absolutely right.
Yes.
can we treat these all at once?
I think if you want to move them all, you could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's-
Makes
Sure.
sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Need a motion?
Yeah,
So moved?
Second.
okay, so now we go to this long list.
Frank, I think we just have to vote on, or do we go back to?
Oh, yeah,
on the
let's,
other one?
all in favor? Okay, great, thanks. All right, so let's go to the long list. Hi,
Hey.
Hey, John.
now, this is not something we need to vote on, right?
No, the administrative transfers are for your information only. These are all the ones that were approved by either me individually or myself with the town administrator based on the authority that you gave us. There are just a couple that I want to point out to you because the change this year is that you granted us authority, no dollar limit on like-to-like transfers. And we did use that 3 times. And I just want to call those to your attention and make you aware that this is how we're interpreting a like-to-like. On page 7, for employee benefits, $29,000. We moved it from workers' compensation to heart and hypertension because those are 2 types of workers' compensation. We had $32,859 moving between different types of legal bills. And then on the last page.
Where's that one?
That one was page,
Top of page 8.
thank you, top of page 8, yep. And then on the last page, page 12, there's $38,000 for Parks and Recreation. The state changed how we needed to classify positions, so we just needed to move the budget out of, they're no longer seasonal, they're considered part-time. We didn't change the nature of the positions, but the classification based on the state definition changed.
Yeah. May I comment, Frank, just as a matter of, again, policy? This is a terrific report, and, you know, I only have a couple more meetings to be kicked around. I don't like to use the term nitpicking, but in terms of administrative transfers as a matter of policy, it's time-consuming, and we're typically, notwithstanding the comments that come with the transfers, the sources and uses comments that we get, they really don't explain often exactly what the reason for the administrative transfer was. My view is we should give the maximum discretion to our Director of Finance and Town Administrator in these matters. And if I may, I know this is not something we're probably going to act on tonight. My recommendation as a matter of policy is that we actually put together a consent calendar and vote on the consent calendar on these matters, giving full discretion, notwithstanding there being some comments, to the Director of Finance to present these to us and not discuss these, typically where we're not briefed, and pick up items where we really are not perfectly well informed. I'd even increase the number in terms of the dollar figure for discretion. That would be my preference. This report highlights the total absolute dollar number. The outlier is Parks and Rec at 55. If you take that $38,000 number out, it really nets to 17, which I don't find to be particularly obnoxious in terms of dollarizing the unit of analysis. The total number of administrative transfers was led by DPW, Parks and Rec at 14 and Police with 20, Parks and Rec with 14 and Police with 13. This is an example that this is not a big issue. This supports the case for giving more discretion to our town, Director of Finance and Town Administrator. So I want to point that out. I'm always against nitpicking, which has become kind of a joke, but I think this is the kind of stuff that we spend a lot of time on for very little return for our taxpayers.
But this is
Isn't
a
what
good
she's doing
report,
right
I
here
think.
is-
I think this is a great report.
We don't have to approve this, right?
Right.
No, it's just for
Yeah.
our information, Joe.
Yeah.
It's a terrific report.
Yeah, so I think it's actually good that
I
we
think
would
it's good to get the
otherwise
report.
would have had to approve these one-offs, right?
Yeah, the dollar amount used to be 500 or
Yeah.
very minimal. And anything touching a salary line used
So,
to.
and my point is, it's in aggregate, $245,000, 129 transfers. It just doesn't add up to being material.
$1,900 a transfer on average.
Yeah.
And if you back out the three largest ones, it's about 1,000 a transfer.
Yeah.
Hey, Jen, can you remind us again, did we do dollar amount for you to approve or number? I forget, I apologize.
Dollar amount.
So,
Dollar amount, right?
Right,
And
so
what,
500 for
For you,
myself
right.
only,
Yeah.
5,000 for Kate
For Kate.
and me to both do it. And
Okay.
then unlimited if it's like to
Like
like.
kind.
Salary to salary, workers' comp to
And I think it was
workers'
a
comp.
carve out if it dealt with like sort of adding a new hire, right?
Right,
A
that
new-
would always come
a
to
new-
you.
A new FTE.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, and that was a good rule.
Let me just add a small caution to this, that the legal counsel one strikes me as the closest call here. And I would have thought if the amount's not that, is not stunning, but if the amount had been 100, I don't think we should have done it this way.
Like to like, yeah,
Yeah.
because it might be something we should be looking at more closely.
Because these are different, it's not seasonal workers to part-time.
Right.
I-
So we could put some dollar amount in there. Because that would signal that we're spending much more than expected versus it's just getting spent out of a different place.
I'm not sure, yeah, it's just something to focus on when you present it, to kind of conceivably, you did a great job of calling our attention to it, so.
Well, John, I think one of the things we looked at in the information request that you put together for like the last few years, I think what it highlights is, I think we typically year to year look at appropriated versus appropriated versus appropriated. And I think this kind of points out, like if we are moving stuff from one line to another, we should maybe be looking at appropriated versus actually spent. And then next year, let's compare what, the departments are asking for, not versus just what they asked for last year, but what they actually spent. Because I think that's,
Actually, Jim, that's a good point, very good point. Don't we do that?
We do, we show that all in the budget book, but a lot of the focus has been on just year-over-year change in budget. This year, when the town administrator put together her budget, she did analyze it more based on what was actually being spent.
Right.
And, if you're not, even if your budget is the same as last year, if you're not spending it, why are we gonna put it in, justify it? So I think it was valuable to look at it that way, and I think that you giving the expanded administrative authority has made departments more aware of putting the expenses in the right buckets, because a lot of times they might try to, in the past, have snuck it in and charge it, oh, this is where I have money, not where it's appropriate to spend
Right.
it, because they didn't want to go through the transfer process, which doesn't make it right.
Well, yeah, 'cause
But
that-
I think that we've given people more empowerment to say, I'll put it in the right place because I know it's not earth-shattering to move the money.
Because I think there are some throughout the budget on all sides, there's always just some that you kind of persistently have extra overages in, and they're just being persistently or consistently transferred to spots that you have underages in. And you should just, you should kind of budget what you actually think each account is.
Right, and in the fiscal 20 budget development, in the book, we actually listed not just the adopted and the revised, but we actually put in what are the transfers, so that it draws a little more attention to where are we moving funds.
Yeah, I think the great thing that gives us, I think this gives us some clarity and should give us some confidence that the department heads, in coordination with the town administrator and director of finance, they're not trying to game the system. There's just no evidence of it.
Yeah, I think the explanation is good. And if this explanation is used when they're building their budget in December, and they come back and they see, let's just say for 2 years, I've over budgeted in oil and under budgeted in salt for the roads, then they'll cause them to go back and
rethink.
think that. So I think it's,
Hey, Jen, can we go back to process for a second? So your limit's 500, Kate's is 5,000
5,000 requires both of us.
for both you guys. So if I look at some of the ones that are over 5,000, right, and they have an August date, if we had met in August, right, because I think we canceled the August meeting, would we have had to approve, like, so top of page 8, the $32,000 one, top of page 7, the $29,000 one? I'm trying to rectify in my head which ones we're seeing and which ones are not, right? So we just went through a bunch, right, with DFD, NFD. One was 12, they're all over 5 except for one, right? So what am I,
Right, so those 3 that I called your attention to that
Yep.
were more than 5, but Kate and I talked about it and said that we felt that it fell under
Under
the
our
authority
purview.
that you granted to us. So the 29,000 is just moving it within 2 types of workers' compensation.
So it's unlimited with like to like.
Right.
no, got it.
And then within legal, we moved it from one type of legal account to another legal account. So we interpreted that as like to like. And then on the Parks and Rec one, it wasn't any change in the type of position. So we felt it really was administrative because the state changed how we needed to define those positions.
Got it, okay. So a little bit of purview or leeways for you guys to say what like versus, what like to like is.
Right, and this
Okay.
is the first time that we've even tested that, because we
Right,
haven't had that situation before.
and none of these are moving from the Board of Finance contingency.
Correct. Any dollar amount, as Jamie has pointed out, that comes from contingency has to come before you guys.
so the only, I guess the concern would be, do we have a concern with them moving $20,000 of environmental legal to 20,000 of labor legal? Like, for some reason, are those not the same? I mean, I don't, like, it's always gonna be on a case-by-case basis. I don't know that you can have any policy that covers everything. But I think, certainly when I looked there on the right-hand column in these, I didn't feel like there was anything that didn't fit the spirit of that.
Right, and me personally, I tend to look at it, if it's even questionable, I would bring it before you.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's a good policy.
It's a great report. Okay.
Hey, just a question on that, is there, if there ever was stuff, are you able to go, like, you ever just reach out to John directly, like the chair, just to get guidance? Probably,
I haven't because it hasn't arisen, but there were, yeah, I think if I was questioning one, I might say, hey, what do you think? Does this fall under our authority, or do you want it to come before your board?
So now we should now we've dealt with transfers, let's jump back up to the donations question.
Right, the 2020 Bicentennial Committee is seeking donations. In order for us to accept those donations and allow them to spend them, we need to approve accepting and appropriating the donations. So they have gone through and developed a list of what they want to do throughout the year, estimated their costs, and took a look at what they think they might be able to fundraise. We didn't want to have to come back through Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM again, so we did kind of ask them to estimate on the high side, so that we could get a not to exceed amount. So they came up with $75,000.
And what is the point of the not to exceed? What if they were to raise 100? They can't?
They can't spend more than $75,000 if this is what moves through.
But we would turn down the last 25, right?
Right.
Or they'd have
Or
to
they
come
would,
back to us
before
and
they could
say,
spend it, they would have to come back. But this should be sufficient to meet their needs based on what they're planning to do throughout the year. And the flip side being, if the donations aren't coming in, they've kind of taken a look at their activities and said, what would they not do if the donations don't materialize?
And what's the town's budget for this?
We appropriated $5,000 in fiscal '20 towards the bicentennial.
And who are they going to raise this money from?
I think mostly residents. I think that they have started putting, either they're planning a mailing, seeking donations, telling people what they're doing and all the,
Is there any concern
planned
about competing
activities.
with the nonprofits in town in terms of raising money?
I have not heard that raised as an issue.
I think the Historic Society, for example, might.
I think that they are collaborating. The committee is collaborating with the other nonprofits, particularly the Historical Society. I think they actually have possibly an event planned for working with the Historical Society.
so Jen, can I just clarify one thing here, and just more mechanics of the resolution? It feels like what we're doing is we're saying any monies that are donated up to 75 are automatically appropriated.
Yes.
But we're not appropriating any funds in excess of those that are actually raised. So if they only raise 10,000, they can't spend
Right,
more
we're-
than the 5 that we appropriated as part of the budget
Right,
process.
that's gonna be a challenge for me working with the committee is, they'll be tracking their donations, but also having to commit funds for upcoming events as donations are coming in. They know that if the donations don't come in, they can't spend the money.
Okay. And council is comfortable that this doesn't sort of appropriate any money that haven't been received?
Right, council wrote this, so.
Okay.
And does this go to the RTM too?
Yes.
What was the question?
Or the RTM also.
So moved.
Okay, do we have a motion? Yeah, thanks.
Festivities too.
January 10th.
And all in favor? Okay, now let's go to the capital projects.
Capital non-recurring, we do this every year. We take a look at the status of the project, see what is complete. If anything is complete, we close it out and move any surpluses to the Board of Finance reserve within the capital non-recurring fund. On the first page is a summary, so we're looking to close out projects that originally had been budgeted at about $2.8 million. We've spent about 2.6, so we'll be moving $200,000 into the Board of Finance reserve. And if you look down below, that's going to put the BOF reserve at about $854,000. What we started last year is looking at projects that have been idle with no activity for 18 months. So those begin on page 5. And I apologize, for some reason the headings on the pages didn't print. But the idle projects begin on page 5. We've actually reduced the number that we have of idle projects, and I would recommend that these remain open. The 2 bridge projects we want to do, we're just waiting on some state dollars. And the town hall surveillance cameras, I think we need to do those, and they're going to be starting to work soon and should have it completed by January. Pages 6 to 11 are projects that we would like to keep open because they are in progress. And that totals a budget of about 5.1 million. We've spent 3.5 so far. There's just under 1.6 still available on those projects. And then finally, we have the ongoing recurring appropriations. Those are on pages 12 and 13. So those are ones that we typically add to every year for the same purpose.
When you have a note that says additional appropriation in fiscal year 2020, I know what that means, but my question is, how does that translate into these numbers?
It's an accumulated total in those numbers, so you don't see just the fiscal 20, what was added. Is there one in particular that you're looking at?
Well, just an example, the top of page 7, vehicle replacement. I'm not picking on that one.
That one, actually, we added $5,000 in fiscal 20. So they've purchased a prior vehicle. We budgeted money in the same account because they're going to get a hand-me-down vehicle through DPW, and they just needed to outfit it with equipment and some other accessories. So what we can do in the future is, if there was an additional appropriation in fiscal 20, we can say specifically what it is so that you can see how much of the available balance is a result of the new
That would be great.
appropriation.
That'd be great. And then I was just intrigued by the digitized documents one.
I was a little intrigued by that one myself. And I did speak with Jeremy Ginsburg about that. When they got their initial quote, we had never done this before. The company came in, pulled out a drawer of their documents and said, okay, this type of document is so much per page, this type is this type. Based on this one drawer, this is what we think it's gonna cost. So then they started doing their project. They got 3 appropriations over 3 years. In the middle of the project, they realized that there were some records that they had originally intended to digitize and had included in the quote, but they realized it wasn't worth digitizing them based on the amount of time that they actually are going back and pulling those records. So they had a very rough estimate. They dialed back the scope, and they ended up with a very significant surplus. So what we're doing is, at least one other department has expressed interest in digitizing their historical documents. So we want to leave that project open, see what other departments might have a scanning need, and use those dollars for other departments.
And that doesn't need to be reappropriated?
No, it was for the purpose of digitizing documents, so.
But it was
stick with
targeted with some initial departments,
that. Right,
Jen.
land use.
Yeah, and so the latitude would be if we can, but, just a reminder, it was targeted for some of the land use areas.
Right, and the main ones that we're looking at are public health for their various sanitation permits and that sort of thing, and the fire marshal's office. So those are consistent with land use documents.
Mhm.
And are we doing away with the paper copies? When we digitize them?
No. The state doesn't recognize electronic documents as official documents, so we still have to store them. But what it really does is save staff time
Yeah.
of going and retrieving them, copying
Yeah,
them,
that.
and makes it more accessible.
A few years ago, when we approved this, Diane and I had the various land use boards, and they were making the recommendation, and it really did work. They had long lines. I mean, they were streamlining just people moving through.
Right.
It also meant you didn't have to store the you didn't either have to go someplace far to get them, or you didn't have to store them right
Right.
there in the office, which was
You didn't need
teeming
something
with,
like
Mm.
with
And I
documents
think
and
it's been
boxes.
very popular with the kiosks out in the hallway, that people can come in, they
Yeah.
can look at the documents and access them. They're right there themselves.
Makes a lot of sense.
And so you think about this, all bondable projects then move on to the other spreadsheet that you put together that sort of tracks budgeted, encumbered, bonded, available. So each one of those projects just have sort of an expanded analysis that we track real time.
Right.
So I would think, in terms of looking at other departments, particularly since the original thing was around consumer, citizen use, whatever the right word is.
Customer service.
Customer service, yeah, that you focus on the customer service component.
Yep.
Another good report, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Hey, can I make one suggestion just in connection with the whole budget season? It may be helpful, just because it came up when we were looking at some of the different school projects that could be bonded, if we wanted to do, just because where rates are, we looked at whether or not there were any refinancing candidates and what capital projects had started to draw down their funds and so forth. Does it make sense when we create next year's sets of projects and we're accumulating all of these capital projects that each one sort of has a expected start and stop date?
We do that on the town side. You get a project request summary for
Yeah.
each capital project that does include start date, expected completion date. We do not get that level of information from the Board of Education. I don't know if they use it internally,
Yeah.
but we don't get that.
I know, when I spoke to Dr. Adley last week at a meeting, and in connection with the bonding, I asked him kind of what was coming down the line. And I think in terms of conversations they're having with the facilities committee, they're going to get an idea of all the outstanding projects that are sitting there, because there are some that have, like the shed was for a couple of years, but a lot of projects that are just kind of floating around out there, not yet started. And so I think it'd be helpful to know, at least when we're approving them, when are they expected to start, when are they expected to stop?
Yeah, and
No.
there's another policy issue here, and of course, it's a little delicate. Jim and I were, I guess you finally could make it when we rescheduled, but in our
Scheduled, right.
audit call, I think it really warrants, thanks for bringing it up, Jim, just warrants kudos to Jim. And that is that all matters, accounting and fiscal controls over capital budget, are consistent between the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education, that we record keep and account for and run policies for all capital projects consistently. I believe it's clearly within our jurisdiction. And the good news is, I think we have an opportunity, Jen, particularly in your role, to socialize the new Director of Finance for the Board of Education in the same regard. And I think, goodwill should be high at this transition time. So anyway, it was good that you brought it up, Jen.
Are all like the dates on the Board of Ed projects, are these all dates that they've kind of fed to you
Yes.
in terms of, yeah? So I think that would be good, maybe when we're putting a new budget together, if we can have dates across all the projects.
I would say, so the project request sheet that we use for the town projects was requested by F&B, and it's kind of expanded and morphed over the last few years to really get at the information that they found meaningful. I would say that maybe we want to have this board decide what are the key points of information that you need submitted with any capital request, regardless of if it's town or Board of Education, so that you are getting the same information. So if there's anything other than start date, end date, maybe expected useful life, because that's can factor into a bonding decision.
Yeah.
Let's have that discussion, and we can pass along to them a format and what the points are that you'd like to receive.
So it'd be helpful, actually, if we get the current forms, right?
Yeah. Well, I think right now, I think during the approval process, on the Board of Ed side, we generally get like level 1, 2, and 3.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, level 1, 2, and 3, then we get fiscal, like that fiscal year, the next couple.
Right.
So maybe what just thinking out loud here, maybe what we could ask for is, for those that are being advanced in that cycle, maybe you add 2 extra columns, like a expected start date or quarter, or just approximately, an expected end date. It's kind of a nice to have, I think, for things that we're gonna tax for, and I think it's a need to have for things that we're gonna bond for, just so we can get a glimpse on whether or not we can raise that money, when we can actually bond for those projects.
Agreed.
So, if there are no further questions, we just need a vote to
Oh,
close
do
out
we?
the identified projects,
Yeah.
just to make it official.
Okay.
The ones at the beginning.
So it's basically just the top line?
Yes,
On
that
your-
200,000, so you
Yeah.
could just make a motion to.
Page 4, Jen?
Yeah.
We're moving 200,000 from all of the closed out accounts into the
Correct.
capital contingency?
So, right. So is there a motion for that? Rob? Second? And all in favor? Okay, now, I'm the one who got us involved in this community values thing. I'm beginning to regret it. But Jen, you want to tell us, you shared with me where we are, but why don't you?
Right, the Board of Selectmen is looking to craft a community value statement. I sent an email on Friday with a link of the type of statement that they're looking to, but it really is kind of a mission, vision statement for the community.
It's a lot longer than
Well, I think that, so the Board of Selectmen is expected to take it up at their first meeting in October, I believe. And what Frank had mentioned in July was if there's anything that the Board of Finance feels strongly about including that. And I think Jamie had mentioned, if any boards want to contribute their ideas, Board of Selectmen would be very open to hearing them. So I think that was where we were coming from in July when it was suggested. But, if there's any financial related values that you feel very strongly about, we could craft some kind of a wording or a suggestion from this board to the Board of Selectmen to include, or to consider including in their final statement.
Well, the 2 things I had in mind were sort of a financial accountability, if you will, and maybe transparency goes along with that. And then, I'm not going to try and get into something that might be construed as cheapskate, but so sort of getting value for the money kind of proposition, that we don't spend too little when that's going to create problems, or spend.
Fiscally responsible?
Yeah. This doesn't have to be front and center. I don't want the town to, but somehow I would think some concept of fiscal responsibility in terms of those kinds of things would be useful. I don't know, what do the rest of you think?
No, I agree with that.
Actually, is the idea here, similar to like the Planning and Zoning Department Commission creates a kind of 10-year plan, and then when topics come up, should we buy this property, should we invest this, they're sort of judged as to whether or not they're consistent with that plan. Is the idea that this value statement would be something like?
Well, this is mission and vision, not planning, right?
Right.
Or,
So, it's kind of mission, vision, goal setting, and so it's something like, having financial accountability and transparency, being fiscally responsible, that might fit into one of the goals, community goals. And so where that would really come into play is when we're looking at a new project or, an appropriation request. In the budget, how do the requests align with these goals that come out of, do they support this vision, mission, and goal statement? Because those, if we have money for new appropriations, we might want to put them towards there because they're supporting the goals and the vision that was put out there.
Well, I guess, yeah, that was my question. Is this something that, kind of when we get to a point where there might be a difficult decision be made, would we sit back and say, well, does that match our value statement that we put together?
It could. I just comment, this may be heretical, but this borders on politically correct. It's redundant in my view. It's full of bromides. It feels good. It could be crafted perhaps in bullet points and be, the town of Dover, Massachusetts is set out to us as an exemplar. Generally speaking, I was appalled when I saw this. I thought it was bureaucracy run amok. But if we can do it and it's succinct, full of salient, truthful tenets around which the town is going to operate, I could support it. But if they are, in fact, explicating those things that already exist in the charter, I would be opposed to the whole initiative. And so it's just full of feel-good bromides. I'm sorry. I'm sure I'll get a call from somebody that'll be upset about it, but it's just, why are we doing this? Anyway, my 2 cents.
Well, it's an interesting point around how it fits with the charter.
Right.
I'm not sure that, I agree that mission and vision statements are necessarily just bromides, because I think they do serve as a guidepost.
For whom?
For the folks like us and others that are supporting the governance of the
For
town.
not-for-profits, for corporations, and so on. For the public good, the common weal, there are self-evident truths around which I believe we want to operate. Do we need to state them? Fine, but I regard that as redundant.
Well, one thing I wasn't clear about was whether this was a forward-looking exercise or a kind of a statement of kind of what's in the DNA of Darien. It's already there. So I just wasn't sure on that score.
Well, that's a good point, though, Frank, as I blather on with my objections. What can we write that stands the test of being distinctive is what I'd ask. That wouldn't be written as is the exemplar of Dover, Massachusetts. What is it that is unique to us that we could state? And if we can't meet that test, I do regard this as a redundant exercise.
I think that's a lot of guidance, Jen.
We may need some adult supervision here.
I just dropped the IQ precipitously.
My only concern from like a legal perspective was if we have something, can then when we go back to making the decisions, the way I think we've done a great job, at least for the 4 years that I've been on here and many before that, do we somehow have to now hold ourselves to that and say, well, we don't want to approve that new vehicle, but our statement says, like, we value shiny new vehicles. Like, can it somehow, can it somehow force us and hold us accountable for that statement in terms of our actions, which, as a Board of Finance, I think it's hard to put a statement just in words to.
Yeah, you're worried about the complaint, how the complaint reads.
I would say to the lawyer on the group, I would say, you set yourself up for litigation if you.
We'll have to put in some exculpatory language and make it longer.
What was the original impetus around wanting to create this?
I don't know. The Board of Selectmen in the past has done a goal-setting session. They did one a couple years ago. And a goal-setting session like that is usually forward-thinking. It is very valuable for looking at the budget, making funding decisions, making decisions about what programs or projects the town wants to invest in because they do support the goals that are stated. But this particular go-around, I don't know if it's just that they want to expand on that or if it's something different.
we'll come back to this. It's good
Well,
for
I can't
now.
wait.
Okay. So let's go to the, John, you want to take over?
Go ahead, you're good.
Let's go to the financial report.
All right, so what you have in front of you is our first look at fiscal '20.
Yeah.
But before diving into that, I do want to just give you a quick update on where things stand with the audit. The auditors were on site last week. We closed our books and turned over all of our reports to them end of August, beginning of September. Things are looking very good in the general fund. We have a final number from the Board of Education of a surplus of $336,000. When we met last time, I think I was telling you we expected the increase in fund balance to be, I don't know, I think I said maybe about 1.8 million. With the surplus from the Board of Education and final closeout of purchase orders, we expect our result of operations in the general fund to be a positive $2,289,000. And then with the closeout of the old inactive funds that was precipitated by F&B, that's another $420,000. So overall, our change in unassigned fund balance is going to be about $2.7 million. $200,000 of that is just a movement from committed to unassigned, so the total fund balance is expected to increase about $2.5 million.
What percentage does that take it to, or refine metric for that?
Unassigned as a percent of budget will be at 17.38%, and our guidance in the policy is 12%.
Now's the time to sell bonds.
John, just,
I mean, I guess my own view is that we ought to take that fund balance and run it against a projection over the next 5 years, and if it looks like we're not going to get anywhere close to 12%, then we ought to draw some of that down. I mean, we did state the fund balance percentage to be not just a floor, but, you know, kind of a ceiling-ish, because if you've gone significantly past that, you've taxed a lot of current taxpayers for a lot of future expenditures, is really kind of what you're doing. But we ought to, I don't think we need to make a change in that now, but we ought to project that out, given this significant increase here, and give it a think for next month.
hey Jen, that 2.5, from a historical standpoint, can you, it feels high to me?
It is
But-
high.
okay.
I know we've had a draw of around that much, probably in the last 10 years. I think we may have had another year with an increase of about 2 million. I don't recall offhand, but it is higher than normal.
If you had to explain, I mean, the big movers, 300 and.
336 for the Board of Ed.
Yeah.
423,000 that we didn't have to transfer from the general fund to the capital reserve fund because our intergovernmental revenues were budgeted very conservatively, and we brought in a lot more than expected. So we were able to hold back what needed to move over from the general fund to make that capital appropriation whole. We have $282,000 left in contingency. Then there's a lot of odds and ends, small items, but Police Department Patrol had a $100,000 surplus. 50,000 of that came from their overtime line, which I know is always one that we like to keep an eye on. And Waste Management had just under $100,000 as a surplus based on their waste hauling contract, which is actually probably going to get looked at again and possibly extended. So we could continue to see savings there.
Was the 250 from the athletic facility, since we canceled that, was that put back in?
No, that will not impact that. That was just a bonding authorization that,
Yeah, we never
Goes
borrowed or
away.
spent any
Right.
money on it, it just sat there.
And we, okay.
right, we didn't have any cash or revenues or expenditures associated with that.
Well, can you guys raise just one thing for some of the people to think about? You know, we had looked at whether or not there were any significant refinancing opportunities on the bond side, and there's only really 4 bonds that were callable, all coming due
Next year.
within a year, but in our next fiscal year. You know, one of them's like an 11-month bond. Jenna, if you have that email, but it has a 4% coupon on it, which is significantly above what we would pay for 1-year debt if we ever went out to refinance it. And then 2 other
Or
ones.
what we would get for the cash.
Well, yeah, so, and right, the other two were smaller, and those are
Right.
like 2% coupons.
Right. So there were three opportunities. And doing a traditional refunding certainly did not make sense. It only gave us like a 2% net present value because they're small and they're very short. But Jim raised the idea of what if we were to call the bonds and pay for it with cash on hand and take the savings on the interest. So what we would have to do in fiscal '20 would be additional principal payment of about $2.1 million. We would save that same amount in principal payments in the future because we're paying it off early. But we would get about $36,000 of interest savings in fiscal '20, just under $40,000 in 2021, and $3,650 in 2022 for that $2 million additional outlay in the current year. It got me thinking of if we wanted to do something with an additional $2 million. This is one option that saves us some money, but I would suggest that we look at other options too. We could use that $2 million and not borrow $2 million less for Oxbridge and save 20 years of interest on that $2 million. We could use it in the next budget to fund annual capital improvements that normally would have been taxed for. So I think that maybe there's a discussion. This is one way to get some savings or, get some additional value out of that $2 million. But I think there might be some
These are
other ideas
mutually
too.
exclusive. The Oxbridge bonding will take place over a couple of years, right?
Right.
And I think the thinking was just to keep it simple, like with one bond, like the $1.5 million bond that comes due in about a year, and that's at 4%.
Mm-hmm.
So what we could do is we could use $1.5 million today, save 1.5 million times 4% is, using round numbers, like 60,000. So we'd avoid 60,000 of interest, and just in today's markets where municipal can be invested, it's just relatively low given where rates are. 10 years at 1.5. I mean, it's just, so we could always then just decide to replenish that amount and just include in next year's budget $1.5 million to be deposited back in, which we could then use to offset bonding for Oxbridge or for other capital projects. I was thinking about it really as an alternative to keeping the $1.5 million here from, just sitting in an account earning 10 basis points from today to, or whatever we're currently earning on it, but I know it's not 4%. And so the idea is if we just bought it at par, really doesn't take very little legal expenses.
I don't know what the legal and the paying agent expenses will probably be very minimal. I have not yet had a chance to have a conversation with bond counsel about this.
I think it's a 30-day notice that we have to
We have to do a
provide
30-day notice.
so that we can save a full year. It'd only be like 10 months, but.
The other piece of it too is our own process required for this. So it would require an appropriation, which will have to go Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, RTM, for the, if it were an additional 1.5 that we want to appropriate for debt service so that we could pay this. 30-day notice, so mid-December we'd have to do the notice. And I don't know exactly what the bond counsel cost would be. So that would reduce our savings from the interest a bit, but not all of it.
Well, I still think we start with taking this large number, make this into our existing fund balance model, and let's take a look at what this looks like over 5 years, just to get a sense for, given what we see, would we still be comfortable saying, we could take this much money out of fund balance, and that's a euphemism for all the different things we're talking about here, whether it's bonding less or refunding or any of this. Let's actually get our minds around that number as a prudence matter and make sure we're comfortable with that. And then maybe at the next meeting, take a look at that number. Maybe it's, I don't know what the number will be, but whatever that number ends up being, let's take a look at that against several of these other options and make a call then. But I think gathering those facts first will help us.
And it's worth knowing what the council cost would be, because that's
Right.
something we should know going forward.
Yeah.
Is it- could be other
Hey,
opportunities.
Jen, can I ask one thing? So it's a pretty big number, right? So I understand what everybody's talking about here, what to do with the money, but can we just flip back for a second? It's a pretty big, and I don't want to use the word miss, because I think it sounds negative, but it's obviously positive for us, $2.5 million. Do you or the group put like a schedule together for the auditors that says, this is what we expected, and this is what it turned out, and here's our variance of 2.5? Can we get a copy of that? Because I think I'm just trying to reconcile in my head, right? We go through budget processes, we meet monthly, we do all this, right? And like I said, I don't want to call that a miss, because it's positive for us, but I'm kind of curious, when we talked about, some of the things, education, 336, 440 for this, I'd like to just kind of take a look at it, because you never start the budget ever too early, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you just kind of go, did we miss here, did we miss there, there's too much here, the health insurance came in less. So if you can, send that list to the group, I think it'd be great.
Sure.
And then to John's point, then we just kind of, the next step would be, what do you do with, like what we've been just saying, what do you do with that extra money? Pay down some debt, put in a rainy day fund just in case Hartford gets silly at some point, which invariably always does, we think is going to happen. So I would just like to start with backwards first and then go forward.
To your point, that number is big, and even though the Board of Ed returned $300,000, I mean, they also sort of advanced and moved forward with a bunch of other new projects that were kind of upwards of, I think, 400 plus.
Right.
So the number could have been even
Could be
larger.
higher, right. Only because we're 6 months away from sitting in these chairs talking about a budget, except for my friend here. And my friend here, and sorry, this side.
No, but you, I think, raise another interesting point, which is if you take the $2.7 million, take out the 420 from old funds, take out the Board Education surplus, you still actually have a large number there that is generated from underspend versus budget across a ton of stuff, okay? And it makes you kind of wonder about implications for the budget process, right? So as an example, could we come in next year and just be a little bit tighter on a few things? Or especially if we do an analysis that says, here are some areas, and this kind of gets to your point about budget transfers, but there could be another analysis that just says, we look back over time at some of these budget line items, and it's possible that maybe the sources of outperformance versus budget, or spending less versus budget, actually comes from the same places.
Mhm.
And so we had a set of facts that would tell us that. We could actually go into the budget process this year and say, well, tell you what, you guys have been running a surplus here for a long time, maybe that's a cushion, I get that, but in the spirit of prudence, what we'd rather do is hold you to what you've been spending historically, and if you need more money, you need to come to us and ask for it, rather than the opposite, which is we ask the taxpayers up front for money that doesn't get spent, and then we got to run around wondering what we're
Yeah,
going to do
and
to
I think
return it.
that's a terrific
That makes
exercise,
sense.
John, and if there are chronic, and I don't think anybody's doing it intentionally abusively, but if there's some department that's a chronic leader in that, we'd identify that in the budget process.
Yeah, so maybe I can give you a call, Jen, and we can think about a simple way to run an analysis to bring some facts to the next
Yeah.
meeting and see what we see, right? It may be so spread out that there's not, or variable year to year, that there's not any identifiable area where you might tighten things up a bit. As concerning as this is, I would remind everyone that the opposite is worse, right? Which is we're systematically overspending versus budget, and there's no clear way to attack that, so.
And
John,
it seems like the biggest chunk was really, I mean, listen, we received more intergovernmental,
Right.
That was a big part of it.
which is
A little
which
bit on
is
us.
great, but I think,
It's a little bit on us, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
because we all budgeted
To John's point a little
conservatively.
bit, when we were just doing the capital non-recurring summary that was basically $200,000 positive, this is like a 7% miss when you look at it compared to the overall spend. Your overall spend is 2.6 and we saved 200. So I was just kind of flipping through, and things like land use software, that was all 15% from the estimate. So the estimate was 368, and it came in at 321, right? Like, so did somebody just kind of throw everything else in, and by the way, maintenance was free for the first year, so we missed it? Like, I always kind of sit there and go, what are the big misses here? Because it looks small until you roll it all up and it's 200 out of a 2.6 spend.
And even
Right.
that 7% is misleading because you have some that were pretty spot on and then you have
Oh,
some
there
that
was-
are wildly off.
Yeah, like I said, the land software, some of them were wildly off, and some of them were, like, the upgrade of the auditorium sound system. it was literally off 50%. Like if they asked for 40, it came out at 26, so it's a 13 delta, 13,000 I should say, right? So you were 50% off. So it gives me a little bit of pause when I just start getting in my head this whole budget process that's gonna start. You know, it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, and boom, we're back here for budget.
Well, maybe
so.
on some of these capital projects, we should sort of ensure that there's real work done in terms of the estimation and bids and,
Yeah.
rather than,
Another change that we can make in the budget process is so right now, this is gonna put our Board of Finance reserve over $800,000. We may wanna have a conversation of what's an appropriate amount to have in there. And-
Retirement party for Jamie, or is that?
Cannoli.
And
I don't know if
Right,
800's enough. But then, in the budget, maybe we want to look at that reserve and say, what's gone into that reserve is money that was already taxed for the purpose of capital projects. And maybe we want to appropriate some of that back out to newly requested capital projects rather than using.
well, I think, didn't we spend like 250 or so?
We did 500,000 from fund balance.
No, but I thought we did, I thought you had there were like 5 or 6 things that we approved out of.
Oh,
capital
out of the
reserve.
reserve throughout the year, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. But it probably would be worthwhile to take a look at that at budget time and say, what's the balance? Is there anything that we want to cover from that Board of Finance reserve?
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I would add is that there's the last few years, there's been this spirit of efficiency with all these town budgets. I have heard remarked a few times where you get department heads that really have stayed on top of their spending in almost a religious way. And so one of the things I don't want to lose in all this is that some of this underspending that we're seeing is reflective of the efforts of those professionals. And we should laud that and continue to encourage that. And so what I don't want this to be characterized as something bad at all. This really is actually very good. Some of it's serendipitous, like the old funds that Jack and the RTM have worked, or F&B have worked on, or the BOE surplus, which is always a mysterious process. But a lot of this really is the result of the efforts of those individuals. And so we should praise that and continue to encourage that. And if we have this same kind of surplus to deal with year after year because of all that efficiency, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and I think it's more I think there's a mindset that it's more difficult to get money moved into a project than it is into an operating line if you're short.
Yeah, fair point.
But didn't you and Kate this year, as part of the budgeting process, I remember there were a few departments where you really sort of changed where you allocated stuff.
Right.
To put the money in getting back to the transfer, putting it in really what it's called, rather than for the last 10 years, it was called paper when you really used it for pencils.
Right, and we also took a hard look at the departments who, I always budget that just in case. We tried to get rid of the just in case dollars. It didn't add up to huge dollar amounts because it might be office equipment or something like that. But we were trying to change the way of thinking when they're putting together a budget. So, and get away from that, but I want to put it in there just in case so I don't have to go ask for stuff. And we want to educate them on the processes and
We have
come
a
and
large,
ask for things.
you should let them know we have a large just in case.
Right. And so, I think fiscal '20 was the first time that we really went through the whole budget with that kind of a view. But I think looking back over the last few years, budgets versus actual, and see if there's any recurring significant variances is going to be worthwhile. So that being said, the other stuff that you have in front of you is not very exciting because we're only 2 months into the fiscal year. Tax collections are doing well. I don't see any cause for concern on that. Nothing really jumps out at me as running hot on the expenditure side, so we are where we would expect to be 2 months in.
Just because some citizens might have questions about it, what was the cause of the big sewer rate increase? Is that something you've got, that was on the paper?
I believe it's related to what we have to pay for Stanford, and I don't know why that has gone up. That's actually a question we have for the audit
Okay.
So we're looking
That might be
into-
good to just have some details on that next time.
Okay, can we go on to the minutes?
Yeah. I'm really excited to see what's
Okay, go ahead, Diana.
I did have one question on the intergovernmental. It looks like normally we would have collected more. Does that tell us something about state funding, or is there anything?
The grants, the formula grants that we receive from the state now are different than they have been in the past. So that's part of it. We may have had one in the past that got paid earlier. The biggest one is ECS, and we get that in October, January, and May.
That sounds right.
Yeah, it's a quarter, and then a half at the end of the year.
So nothing that should signal particular concern?
No.
Okay, thanks.
And the biggest piece is like in the ECS, like that's built into the budget, right?
Right.
Doesn't mean we're gonna get it, but
It's in the state budget, it's in our budget. We
Yeah.
are most likely going to receive it.
You know, it says Darien for it, right?
so long as the state pays its bills, we'll get it.
Any more on that? Should we go on to the minutes?
You got a correction. Sergeant is misspelled, unless that's his first name.
Touche.
Where is that?
Others
others.
attending.
That is
That's
a word I can
on
never
page
spell.
1 and the top of page 2.
Oh, here, I thought we caught them all.
Other than that, it looks okay to me.
Everybody else okay? You have a motion to approve the July minutes? John? Rob, second, good. All in favor? Special assignments, committee
I
reports?
can't vote on that.
Oh, you can't vote on that, sorry. Thank you, Jamie.
Well, Fairview Point?
Conversation is advancing. There has been, we continue to get considerable amount of public comment. We did move in the last meeting to move forward to have discussions with the various regulatory bodies, the state and also town, to just determine whether or not the most recent, the plan, the latest iteration of the plan is something that is actually doable. And there's a plan that has a considerable amount of support on the committee, but there's also some dissension, so I'd say it's still moving forward, but slowly.
It looks like it's getting a little bit contentious at times.
Oh, it definitely has
Yeah.
been. Yes, it definitely has been contentious at times. I think there's some division on the committee. We've had a lot of, public comment, and there's a lot of, I think really, my perspective on where we are is that the charge for the committee and the objectives that have been set out by, in the charge, are not all doable at the same time. So there's going to have to be some compromise made in order to protect the beach. We would need to do some things that don't meet other objectives. And so there is some conflicting objectives that are going to require compromise, and compromise is always difficult. And so there has been some, finding the pain points, addressing them and coming up with a compromise. I actually think we've come up with some really pretty good compromise plans. And some of the things that come up for discussion are berms versus seawalls versus nothing versus, you know, not addressing the flooding or erosion problems at all. And none of them is going to meet with approval by everyone. And so we've basically had to come up with some compromise solutions. It's been very difficult to get to a consensus on everything.
So what's the timeline now?
That was my question. Has the group tried to pencil in a deadline for saying, let's come up with a plan by this day?
Not really. I think that the consensus is to come up with a plan that's palatable. We've actually made a ton of progress and we have moved forward. There has been a decision made to move forward on reviewing whether or not the current plan that is proposed is something that could be achieved. It would require a couple of variances. Not surprising because the existing building is already over setbacks, so we'd have to find out whether that would be grandfathered in, but since they're making some changes to the building, it would likely require new variances, so we'd have to figure out if we can get those, things like that. And so we did vote to move forward and investigate and authorize the architect to move forward and have those discussions with the state and the town to see if the current proposed structure from the building perspective is doable. And then from the beach perspective, because there has been discussion and differences of perspective on not just on the building but also on addressing every other aspect of the beach, whether there's berms, whether there's more sand or less sand, whether the parking lot is expanded or retracted. And one of the things the committee has determined is that we really do have an opportunity here to actually not only preserve what we have, but maybe even get a little more beach. And the one thing everyone has consensus around is preserving the beach. So in order to preserve the beach, it's difficult to put in 10-foot berms because you lose a lot of beach. So there's I think, been a lot of very healthy discussion on all of these issues. We've brought in experts. We've really thought it through. And I think you're just never going to get to a point where every stakeholder in this particular instance is happy. There's going to be some compromise that has to be made in order to move forward.
We, in terms of the teacher's contract, I'm sitting the Board of Finance representative with the members of the Board of Ed on that contract negotiation for the next 3 years worth of their salary contracts. We had our first negotiating session last week, and we have a couple more scheduled in the following week. Many of them are on Friday nights, coincident with the home football game, but I think we're...
So you
How
have
does-
more fun on Friday nights
Yes,
than you
yeah.
normally do?
That's
And how does discussion-
American football?
Yes.
I see.
Yes. But it's going well. It's been a pleasure to kind of work with Dr. Hadley and the new finance director is, I think, like 12 days into his job, but he's involved too, and it's things are moving along.
Jen's accumulated some information on the credit cards, right? Finally, finally got some information out of people.
Right, we haven't summarized it or analyzed it yet, but we took a different approach. Rather than telling the departments what pieces of information to provide to us, we kind of changed it around and said, here's what we're after, but what report can you produce? And then we'll compile it and see where our gaps are. So credit cards and credit card fees are still on the list. They haven't completely fallen off, so we actually do have some information to start working with.
Somewhere I can hear Jack say yay. Okay.
He's watching.
Oh, I know he
He's-
is.
He's paying attention.
It hasn't been forgotten, it is still a
That's
work in
good.
progress.
It'll make Diane and I happy also.
So let's go on to the chairman's report.
Well, just two things on my mind. One of them is at the just having discussions with Dr. Adley, one of the things that he mentioned from his work with boards of finance, where he used to be, was going to the Board of Finance and having a regular update for that board. And that resonated a lot with me. I think having an active and more open dialogue with the superintendent, not every meeting, maybe even just once a quarter, I think will change our rhythm and cadence with the Board of Education in a productive way, particularly in the lead up to the budget season. And I know it will help him to get a chance to know us and kind of know how we look at things. And that should feed into his own budget process. So creating a good working relationship with him up front in clear coordination with the Board of Education. I'm not saying doing something where we're not on the same page with that board and Tara, their chairman. That said, I'd like to invite him to come to our October meeting to introduce himself, give some highlights about how he's thinking about things, and particularly to the extent that there's anything with prior budget processes that he's been involved in that would actually inform what we're doing here. So in terms of how he's been involved, effective ways to collaborate or communicate between the superintendent, the administration, and the Board of Finance, all those types of things, frankly, I'd like to hear that. It just gives us sort of a fresh eyes view about that process that we might not have had in quite a while, and I'd love to take advantage of it. He's offered to do it, and so my intention would be to talk to Tara either this week or first of next, and make sure we get that invitation extended formally. So unless anybody had any protest or anything about that, I think that'd be a good thing to do. Next thing, and we touched on this briefly, but Jim very helpfully surfaced what I think is very interesting information about the transfers, right? And so just to refresh everybody, the nature of this data was to, or this data poll was to go back and look at sort of original budget, what we ended up spending, and the transfers between them, and trying to get a sense for the ebbs and flows of transfers over an extended period of time, not just for the town budget, but the Board of Education budget. And you could describe all that much more adeptly than I can. But I think the question that I would have is, at what point would we like to maybe discuss some findings of all that? And maybe a perspective or two that you've gotten from looking at that data that might inform the budget process. The reason, of course, for asking now is that, well, we're about to launch onto the budget process. And a big reason for looking at this data was to answer the question, is there anything in here that would inform that budget process in terms of something we should do different?
So I would say probably by next meeting,
Okay.
have some,
Yeah, if you need some help, by the way, I mean, we can all.
Would it be better to do it in November with the new board maybe? I don't know. If it's focused on the coming budget process.
Good point. Either way, it's going to be multiple meetings, I think, where this is discussed. And if we had anything even preliminary for the October meeting, that actually could be something we mentioned to Dr. Adley. And I'd like that to be all very open and transparent with them. I wouldn't say it all has to be done at once, but just to start the dialogue.
I think
it's
October
relevant.
would be good, because I think they really start diving into their budget process.
Right. it's
Like
kinda
kind
what
of
it is
late
now, right?
October, early November, right?
Yep. So I think if we can get something on that, even if it's preliminary, or even if it's just Board of Education focused, and we do town later, if you can't get to that. But the idea, again, would be to use that to surface some maybe changes we could make in our budget process, or just to provide a list of questions that we ask. Well, you budgeted this, but we've looked back at the transfers, and we've noticed that these particular line items have historically been over budgeted, and those funds have been used for something else. What do you think? And then just have a discussion about it.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of symmetric with the discussions we had tonight about, on the Board of Selectmen side, in terms of, overages under, in terms of budgeting, so.
Yeah, the only other thing I would mention is the Oxbridge Building Committee is actually pretty public. There's a lot to read about that. There's excellent leadership, I have to say, by that committee by Kip and Duke. They co-chair it, and the quality of people that are participating, not just on the committee. And the committee, by the way, has added some new members, which I think will help. but also just the third parties that are involved. It's quite impressive to see everybody not just producing their own work, but doing it collaboratively with everybody else. So I remain extremely confident in that process, and I look forward to seeing them present some of their initial design recommendations in a more public way very soon. That's all I got.
Okay, any other business? Okay, can we get a motion to adjourn? A second? All in favor? Okay, Channel 79, you're off the hook.